Well, good afternoon, everyone from Bangkok. Welcome to this special event. My name is Roy Wadia. I'm the Communications Advisor for the UNFPA Asia Pacific Office. This is the launch of our annual flagship State of World Population Report. And we are actually coming to you live across the world from Facebook and our YouTube platforms. It's my pleasure now to turn to our Regional Director Bjorn Anderson, who will share with us what the report is all about. And so over to you, Bjorn. Thank you.
Thank you, Roy, and a warm welcome to all of you joining us for this special event on this very special day. And let me start with giving you some background and giving you also the context in which this report has been launched today. Each year, UNFPA, the United Nations Sexual and Reproductive Health Agency, launches its annual flagship State of the World Population Report. The report focuses on a theme under UNFPA's mandate of working towards a world where every pregnancy is wanted, every childbirth is safe, and every young person's potential is fulfilled. And this year, our report titled Against My Will addresses the difficult topic of harmful practices against women and girls, primarily child marriage, female genital mutilation, and gender-based biased sex selection, fueled by son preference and the unwantedness of girls. Ending gender-based violence and harmful practices is one of UNFPA's key transformative results, along with the ending maternal deaths and unmet need for family planning. And indeed, we have made a significant progress towards these results in the past 25 years, and since the landmark 1994 International Conference on Population and Development was held in Cairo. That's where 179 governments agreed upon the ICPD Program of Action, which for the first time put individual rights and choices at the very heart of sustainable development, with a particular focus on the rights and choices of women and girls. ICPD is grounded in human rights. It recognizes that ensuring sexual and reproductive health and reproductive rights, achieving gender equality, and eliminating child marriage and other harmful practices is a prerequisite for achieving sustainable development. But to fulfill this vision and these rights, we need an optimal environment as well. An environment where girls are valued the same as boys and allowed to complete their education and access economic opportunities just as boys are. An environment where women and girls are free of violence and harmful practices. An environment which fosters a healthy life cycle from the womb through birth, from childhood through adolescence, through adulthood, and ultimately through a healthy old age. The ICPD Program of Action, which envisioned this, is more relevant than ever today, and especially in view of the Sustainable Development Agenda and its Sustainable Development Goals. We simply cannot achieve the SDGs unless we achieve ICPD, something that governments, civil society, and other partners around the world recognized and affirmed at the ICPD 25 Nairobi Summit last year. Now, let me turn to this year's SWOP. The idea for this year's State of World Population Report actually emerged from the Nairobi Summit, where a range of participants called upon UNFPA and partners to tackle ever more strongly the scourge of harmful practices against women and girls. The report focuses on the three most prevalent ones: child marriage, female genital mutilation, and extreme bias against daughters in favor of sons. Just today itself, 33,000 girls under the age of 18 will be forced into marriage, usually to much older men. More than half of all child marriages happen here in Asia, 44% in South Asia alone. and also an extreme preference for sons over daughters in some countries has fueled gender-biased sex selection, postnatal discrimination, and extreme neglect that leads to their death as children, resulting in 140 million missing females, the majority of these in Asia. And this year, an estimated 4.1 million girls globally will be subjected to female genital mutilation. And in Asia Pacific, an estimated 1 in 2 girls in Indonesia, for example, undergoes this harmful practice. Countries that have ratified international treaties, such as the Convention on the Rights of the Child, have a duty to end these harmful practices, whether they are inflicted on girls by family members, religious communities, healthcare providers, commercial enterprises, or state institutions. Many countries have responded with laws, but laws alone are not enough. Decades of experience and research show that bottom-up, grassroots approaches are better at bringing change, as the report clearly demonstrates. Economies and the legal system that support them must be restructured to guarantee every woman equal opportunities, and this is something that the report adds on. Changing rules for property inheritance, for example, can eliminate a powerful incentive for families to favor sons over daughters and help to eliminate child marriage. Ending child marriage and female genital mutilation worldwide is possible within the next 10 years by scaling up efforts to keep girls in school longer and teaching them life skills, and by engaging men and boys in social change. Investments totaling $3.4 billion a year through 2030 would end these 2 harmful practices and end the suffering of an estimated 84 million girls, the report shows. Now, let me turn to the COVID-19 threats. And the State of the World Population Report is being launched, of course, at a particular crucial time in our lifetime. And amid the COVID-19 pandemic, which has already devastated economies and plunged millions into poverty again, a socioeconomic crisis whose impact is still unfolding. It is already clear, however, that the pandemic is significantly interrupting programs to end harmful practices. These include programs to end female genital mutilation, and as a result, an additional 2 million girls may be harmed over the next decade. And COVID-19 is also disrupting efforts to end child marriage, potentially resulting in an additional 13 million child marriages between 2020 and 2030. All of this makes it all the more urgent for us to refocus efforts to accelerate the ICPD program of action if we are to safeguard progress made in recent decades and ensure that the SDGs remain on track. The report being launched today stresses 3 key human rights principles that can bring real change and real results for women and girls. The first is respect. We must foster respect for women and girls by changing entrenched cultural attitudes and practices that dehumanize them and regard them as commodities. This means identifying, targeting, and disrupting root causes of inequality and respecting girls' autonomy. The second is protect. We must protect women and girls by enacting and enforcing laws against harmful practices like child marriage and female genital mutilation, even as we work with parents, families, communities, and entire societies to change attitudes and norms. And the third and last one is fulfill. Governments must fulfill the obligations under human rights treaties that require the elimination of female genital mutilation and child marriage. There is no point having wonderful words on paper if frameworks and agreements are not implemented. This year, 2020, begins a decade of action to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. including the so-called target 5.3 on ending harmful practices. UNFPA here in Asia and the Pacific is launching the 2020 State of World Population Report during 3 special events with globally renowned experts and activists. Today, we will focus on child marriage. Next week, we will address gender-biased sex selection. And the week after next, we will have a special panel of young persons taking on harmful practices. We thank all of you for joining today and call upon all of you to do what you can do to help end harmful practices against women and girls. Each of us can and should play an important part. What we do now will shape the lives and futures of millions of girls and women in the years ahead. And once again, thank you so much for joining us today. And I now hand over to Roy. Thank you. You're muted, Roy.
Sorry about that. Thank you so much, Bjorn, and thank you all for being here today. Before we turn to our special panel with 3 special guests, we have a video that we would like to share with you. It comes from Nepal. So can we please play the video? Thank you so much.
मैले हेरेर न सुरुमा बहिनीहरु आउँदा नि अलिकति लजाउन टाइपको छ के हैन उलाई घर भित्र मात्र नराखेर हैन बाहिरको यस्तो स्पोर्ट्सहरुमा लायो भने न बेटर केही गर्न सक्छ होला पछि गएर हैन
हामी यस सञ्जालमा 30 जना केटी छौं 30 जना छौं भने 30 जनाले बाल विवाह आफ्नो रोक्छन् भने त्यो गाउँको जुन सानो केटीहरु हुन्छन् किशोरीहरु तिनीहरु पनि भन्छन् उ दिदी हामी भन्दा ठुलो भइसक्नु भयो उहाँको बिहे भए छैन अहिले हाम्रो किन गरिराख्नु भएको छ भने तिनीहरु पनि सवाल उठाउन सक्छन्
म भन्छु कि सम्पूर्ण आमा बुवाले चाहिँ अब यस्तै गरी छोराछोरीमा भेदभाव नगरोस् यो बाल विवाह चाहिँ सबैले रोकोस् भन्ने चाहन्छु
सानै उमेरमा रजस्वला नभइकन कन्यादान गरेपछि पुण्य हुन्छ भन्ने पुरानो विचार थियो त्यो विचारलाई अहिले हामीहरूले धामी पुजारी ज्योतिषहरूले के गरेका छौँ भनेदेखि 20 वर्ष नपुगिकन विवाह गरेपछि पुण्य होइन, अहिले पाप पुण्य प्राप्ति हुँदैछ। आफ्नो छोरीलाई आफ्नो खुट्टामा उभिने, आत्मनिर्भर बनाउने, आफूलाई बुझिसकेपछि मात्रै उसको विवाह गर्ने भन्ने अहिले हामीले चाहिँ जुन समाजका धार्मिक व्यक्तित्वहरूबाट त्यो किसिमको पाइला चालिएको छ।
सर्टिफिकेसन गरेर किशोर किशोरी मैत्री स्वास्थ्य सेवा दिनलाई गुणस्तरीय रूपमा दिनलाई कम्तीमा पनि न्यूनतम यो सेवाहरू चाहिन्छन्, यो टुल्सहरू चाहिन्छन्, यो तालिम प्राप्त स्वास्थ्य कर्मीहरू। अब त्यो सबै भयो भनेपछि किशोर किशोरीहरूले अलिक गुणस्तरीय रूपमा सेवा पाउने भएको।
केटीको कमाई छोरीको कमाई खाइरहेको फल्लले भन्दाखेरि त पहिला अलि धेरै हेला गर्थेँ, मलाई पनि दुःख लाग्थ्यो, मैले पनि रुन्थेँ के कस्तो समाज छ मेरो। अनि आजकल त भन्दैन, त्यही मान्छे बरु मलाई बोलाउँछन्, भन्छन् नानु कहाँ गइरहेको छु, धेरै चिनजान भएको मान सम्मान दिन्छन्, त्यही गरेर गर्छन्।
के खा सकथिन् अपने गोड़े खड़ा रही जो
दादा मैं का मन के तालीम देव नहीं कहा जाता, चित्र करते हैं।
Years ago, I would worry if the dolly they put me in would fit my quiet protest, bent frame and bones that did not need someone else to lift them from my own feet. Today, my voice is liquid courage that distills words measured in worth, not by the years they've been spoken for, but the amount of sense it makes. It makes sense for me to say it aloud. I am proud to be independent. I am proud to be independent.
Thank you for that video. Now we turn to a special in-depth discussion on child marriage. We've got 3 special guests, and the session will be moderated by my colleague, Ingrid Fitzgerald. Ingrid, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Roy, and thank you, Bjorn, for those introductory remarks. I'm Ingrid Fitzgerald, and I'm the Gender and Human Rights Advisor here with the UNFPA Regional Office in Bangkok. A warm welcome again to everybody. Thank you for joining us today, and a very warm welcome also to our panelists for joining us for this session on child marriage, one of the harmful practices addressed in this year's State of the World Population Report. And I'll just say a little bit about child marriage before we open up to the panel. I think it's commonly known that this region has some of the highest rates of child marriage globally, and with high levels of prevalence, in particular in South Asia. In Bangladesh, 59% of women aged 20 to 24 were married under the age of 18, 40% in Nepal, and 27% in India. And while there is encouraging news that the prevalence of child marriage in the region has fallen, due in large part to reductions in India, in terms of sheer numbers alone, the burden of child marriage in South Asia remains very high. An estimated 223 million women were married as girls in India alone. There is a broad partnership in place to end child marriage, and we're very pleased to welcome some of our key partners to the panel this morning, including UNICEF and Girls Not Brides, as well as those with us in the audience today. Together, we are working to end child marriage by implementing a comprehensive and integrated approach, which includes empowering girls, working with families and communities, ensuring access to services, building the evidence base for change, and working to ensure laws and policies are in place to end this harmful practice. But there are still important gaps that we also need to address. For example, the very laws and policies that are designed to protect young people, in particular adolescent girls, from child marriage, have in some cases been used to break up close in age consenting peer relationships. There's also been a tendency at times to treat all child marriage as non-consensual or arranged, where in fact there is significant variation in the forms of child marriage and patterns that it takes across the region. And finally, and critically, empowering girls without offering options and opportunities outside of marriage is not enough to make a real difference in their lives. Unless we change marriage itself as an institution to make it more equal, respectful, and supportive, it may not make that much difference whether a girl marries at 16 or at 18. And furthermore, the reality is that all the gains made to date are under threat as a result of COVID-19 and the associated lockdown and recovery measures. We had assumed, I think, that marriages would decrease as a result of the pandemic and associated lockdowns, but it appears that this is not the case. And we're hearing anecdotally and through services such as helplines that there is an increase in child marriages, including as a way to manage or escape from insecurity. And we may see an increase in self-initiated as well as arranged marriages across the region as a result. And there's a risk that the pandemic may reinforce and exacerbate the unwantedness of girls in countries where child marriage is also prevalent. All of this just goes to underscore how important it is that we continue our collective work to promote gender equality, provide girls with access to education and sexual and reproductive health services and information, and to give opportunities and choices outside marriage, all of which is so critical. So I'm now going to turn to our panelists to discuss these and other drivers and dynamics that underpin and perpetuate child marriage in our region in Asia Pacific. I'll introduce them in turn and we'll have several rounds of questions. And then we hope to open up to questions from our audience joining us online. So turning now to our first speaker, Rachel Yates. Rachel is the Director of Learning and Regional Implementation at Girls Not Brides, the global partnership to end child marriage, which undertakes global and regional advocacy in relation to child marriage, working with over 1,400 member organisations around the world to support evidence-based advocacy and programming as part of community-level and nationally led efforts. So Rachel, from Girls Not Brides' perspective, why do we see child marriage continuing to exist in so many countries around the world? What motivates you to work on this issue of child marriage? And why are partnerships, including partnerships with civil society, so critical in our efforts to end this harmful practice?
Thanks so much, Ingrid. And I think it's important to say, and you touched on it yourself, that what motivates us is not just about reducing the numbers of girls who marry before the age of 18, but it's really the significant thing is about giving girls and women the same rights and opportunities as men and boys, and enabling girls to make the critical choices that affect their lives, including when and if to marry and if to have children. And really, the issue is about increasing girls' voice, choice and control and enabling them to reach their full potential. So that's really what motivates us at Girls Not Brides. So the causes, as you know, there are many different causes, and also it means that there aren't one single magic bullet for tackling child marriage. We know that child marriage is a global phenomenon. It's not linked to any particular sort of religion or creed, but is really a manifestation of gender inequality and harmful social norms, which means that less value is placed on girls than boys. And this manifests itself in many ways. These harmful social norms can be seen in the form of child marriage, FGM, or son preference. So it's very relevant that the State of the World's Population Report is looking at these issues together. So we, as well as the sort of harmful norms, we know that many of the other drivers include poverty, that many households, poorer households, often see girls as an additional burden. And in context, they may want to marry daughters off to have one less mouth to feed. In some contexts where there is bride wealth, it can be obviously seen as an opportunity to get some income from girls. And during sort of humanitarian crisis, and in extreme poverty, which we're seeing more during the COVID context, there's an increasing commodification of girls where basically girls are being almost traded for basic sort of household commodities to keep household heads above water. So I think the second part of the question was really about why we see civil society partnerships and what is the power of partnership to tackle child marriage. And at Girls Not Brides, we support at the national and state level coalitions of civil society who are working together to tackle child marriage. And I think during the sort of present COVID lockdown, we're really seeing a sort of spotlight on the importance of these sort of strong coalitions and really the importance of a localization agenda. After all, it is many of the sort of grassroots organizations who are able to get out there and do things, with many other organizations grounded and unable to provide support. So some of the examples of the partnerships that we're working with, first of all, I'd like to just touch on one that we're working with in Bangladesh. And the Bangladesh National Partnership have been truly amazing in what they've been doing. And working together with a number of other agencies, including UNICEF, coming together to improve communications around COVID, looking at creating awareness of households around the pandemic itself, but also helping to track increasing rates of GBV and looking at sort of violence within the community and being able to report these, and using various mobile technology. They're helping to sort of track the increased prevalence of violence and link girls to services. Also, we're seeing partnerships working on issues like psychosocial consultation for girls via social media, and really sort of helping them to get the support they need. And I think this is becoming a really important issue around new referral pathways during lockdown. Just another partnership I wanted to touch on, which I think is a very interesting example in Rajasthan. The state partnership is working very closely with young activists and supporting youth-led research to really amplify the voices of girls affected by COVID, and making sure they get the support they need. So they're looking at how COVID is affecting girls, what their needs are, and this is going to translate into a charter of demands for the girls themselves and for the organisations that support them. And really, this will be communicated through to state government to create a more enabling environment for girls going forward. So I think these sort of partnerships are absolutely critical, both in the uncertain times of COVID, but also in more normal times when this sort of grassroots advocacy is critical for enabling change. But I'll just stop there for now.
Thanks so much, Rachel. And thanks also for starting off the discussion on the impact of COVID. And we'll pick that up later in the panel as well. But for now, let me turn to our second speaker, Noreen Kahn. Noreen is the gender advisor for UNICEF Bangladesh, where she leads the work on the UNICEF UNFPA global program on child marriage, so a close partner of ours. Noreen has worked with UNICEF for almost 20 years at the global and country level as a gender expert, including for 9 years in Pakistan and the South Asia region on issues including women's economic empowerment, social norms, honour killings, child marriage, and work with men and boys for gender equality. So Noreen, I'm going to put you on the spot. Why are rates of child marriage still so high in Bangladesh, especially given the significant gains on gender equality in areas like participation in education and employment when compared to other countries in the region where rates of child marriage are lower, but overall indicators on gender are worse? Over to you, Noreen.
Thank you very much for the question, Ingrid. And yes, you're absolutely right. Bangladesh is doing quite well, has significant gains in terms of gender equality in areas that you mentioned. But, if we really look at it very critically, when we talk of gains, for example, in education and employment, we're not really reaching the standards, gender equality standards for both of those areas, because, we are focusing a lot on secondary education, but now we are starting to look at more employability and alternative learning pathways, especially for the most marginalized. These are two approaches that are becoming, and we have lessons learned that are extremely important, for example, for us to move the agenda on education for adolescent girls. But I think what is also important to know is that, through many studies that we have done, we see that the strongest relationship is found in variables related to what is perceived to be happening in the community. The knowledge of consequences matters, as well as the knowledge of what is child marriage, but not the knowledge of law. So we have done in Bangladesh very well at the national level in terms of like regulatory context, frameworks. There's a Prime Minister's commitment. So all of that normative framework is there. But at the community level, what matters most is a couple of things. In light of what I just said in terms of the relationship between different variables, I think what is coming out very strongly is that we need to change the paradigm of what it means to be a child. We need to look at the power of consent. We need to leverage that to accelerate the reduction. And we really need to look at the major driver of child marriage, which is underlying social norms and perceived prevalence in the community. In Bangladesh, especially in areas where the prevalence is very, very high, the social norm, the underlying gender norms are extremely important to people. So I think what we need to do together with all the partners is really to unpack those social norms and see what is not changing. So with UNFPA under this global program, we are trying to go into very qualitative research over a period of 2.5 years, starting in August, to really look at the pockets where the prevalence is high and where social norms are not changing. So I think that's one thing. The last point I want to make here is that I think keeping girls in school will prevent child marriage. But it does prevent this vicious cycle. But like I said, what is very, very important is alternative learning pathways for the most disadvantaged girls, and really employability we need to look at employability. So even after secondary education or college education, girls do not have that kind of opportunity, and that is the only way to increase the value, to make the economic argument. When we show girls are empowered enough to contribute to the economic status of the household, is where we think a big change will come. And just to make a small point, that we don't have any counterparts in the government. We don't have any capacity at the government level at this point in terms of really working on social norm change and looking at the gender norms. We are working with NGOs. We are working with the consortium, the Girls Not Brides, Plan International. But I think we really need to look at how we scale up some of the stuff that we are doing in our selected districts, 4 districts where we work together. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Noreen, and thanks for highlighting the issues around social norms. And I think it's something else we'll probably pick up on over the session, but the way that social norms intersect with and reinforce structural inequalities, I think, is very clear in the case of child marriage. And also what you said about what communities perceive to be happening in their own community, and how that can be much more powerful than the law, even if we know what the law is. So I think we'll pick up on some of those points over the next 30 minutes or so. But now, let me now turn to our third panellist, Mary E. John. So Mary is Senior Fellow and Professor at the Centre for Women's Development Studies in New Delhi, and was formerly the Director of the Centre, and prior to that, the Deputy Director of the Women's Studies Program at JNU University in New Delhi. And her work includes a focus on family and marriage, including early and child marriage, and her book, Child Marriage in an International Frame, a Feminist Review from India, is forthcoming. So Mary, your recent work has focused extensively on son preference and now on child marriage. What interested you in working on child marriage and its historical context in India? And why is marriage a compulsory institution for women and girls in so many countries?
Thank you, Ingrid, and I want to thank everyone for inviting me to be part of this panel and part of the launching of the World Population Report. I think your question actually helps me locate. In fact, it is very much, if you look at my work, I have in fact been engaging with gender-biased sex selection quite extensively for several years, and more recently been invited to engage more closely with early and child marriage. And it is indeed what I have been calling the institution of compulsory marriage that I think is the actual frame. More than, I think, social norms, more than agency, I would suggest, at least for India, and I'd be very interested to know whether this would apply and work constructively elsewhere as well. Compulsory marriage is actually the frame within which we can understand why certain phenomena persist, perhaps decline to some degree, and so on, but do not go away. When I use the word compulsory, what do I mean? I'm talking about an institution that is fundamental to almost all women. I don't, by compulsory, I don't mean forced marriage. I'm also, in compulsory marriage contains both so-called choice, self-initiated, as well as so-called arranged, in other words, intergenerationally decided. So it's a large term, and it's being fueled, at least in India, by the fact of and this has come up, I think, in the Bangladesh presentation as well, very low, meaningful, gainful employment opportunities for women. We are one of the lowest in the world, in fact. What this means then is that the principal institution for economic security is not work, but marriage. We have to think of an institution like marriage performing multiple functions, beginning with economic security, going on to social status, and finally to sexual respectability. So it's performing multiple functions. It's a complex market. It affects everyone. In other words, it's a hierarchical market within which the well-to-do, the highly educated are participants. Being better educated, being wealthier, they marry at somewhat higher ages, under better conditions, unlike their poorer counterparts who marry with poorer, capital, poorer inputs, lower levels of education, and hence find lower kinds of husbands in that corresponding marriage market. So I want to indicate that child marriage itself is contained within this larger phenomenon, which actually touches the lives of almost everyone. Certainly in India, we have practically I think we're 98% people marry. There are very, very low rates even of divorce because of the economic costs of such breakdown. I think this is the principal place from which we need to look. Within that, we have seen impressive increases in education in India, and that, I think, has been the principal driver for the fact that, as you mentioned, Ingrid, India has seen impressive declines in underage marriage in the last decade, and these are supported by both census as well as National Family Health Survey data. And it's also anecdotally, I think we are seeing, I would call, a shift from what one might call child marriage to what I would rather call late adolescent marriage. Most marriages are now happening in the age group of 15 to 17. So this is the phenomenon we are seeing. Within that, however, and within these impressive declines, we are still facing, I think, severe challenges. And to my mind, the principal driver that is actually preventing the situation from improving any further is, in fact, the absence, and I think Noreen pointed this out, we are seeing expansion in education in some sections, not so much in others. It's not a surprise that in rural India, the figures are much, much higher than in urban India. This is where schooling ends at elementary levels. High schools, secondary education, let alone entry into colleges, are few and far between. And the link with education and employment is the weakest of all. We have the most complex market for education and marriage. We have the weakest possible market for education and work. And this is, I think, a very, very major challenge. Even your well-to-do postgraduate women are not necessarily finding jobs, but they are finding husbands at ages of 23 or 24, right? Versus the girl at 16 who has barely finished class 10, has very few other prospects, and then her family is looking out for, and especially if she's dropped out of school, has very few other prospects, anxieties build up, you're looking for a good and quote-unquote good match. So in my view, these are the contexts within which we need to actually focus much more carefully in terms of evidence building and so on, to ask, what would agency mean here? What would social norms mean here? And what change would actually make a difference? Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mary, and thank you for highlighting the way that child marriage sits within the broader institution of marriage in the Indian context. But of course, this is very relevant for, I think, all countries, but particularly countries where child marriage remains very high. And also for highlighting that education has become a pathway to marriage, but not necessarily a pathway to work. And I think that's a very interesting point. And it's one of the reasons that child marriage persists. So I think we've heard in this first round from our panel about some of the drivers and some of the manifestations of child marriage in the region and globally. But I'd like to dig now a little bit more into some of this, and I can also see that questions are starting to come in from the floor, so I think we will have time for some of those, and I'll try and pick up on them as we go as well. So Rachel, I'm coming back to you, and you started talking about the current situation with COVID-19 and the lockdowns and recovery measures. And I'd like to ask you to say a little bit more about what you're seeing on child marriage, and what you're hearing from members on the ground about the impact that COVID is having on child marriage globally and in Asia Pacific.
Thank you. And, you know, this has obviously been an incredibly challenging time for all agencies, but I think particularly for civil society organisations working on the front line. I think one of the most immediate impacts that we were hearing from members, and we did a sort of online survey, we've had sort of 20 plus Zoom calls with members to get their perspectives, and are really trying to use this information to basically inform those who are in a position to fund more gender responsive responses, but also an opportunity for members to learn from each other about the adaptations they're taking. So some of the early things we've been hearing about around access to education, and there's obviously been very significant dropouts from school. I think UNESCO estimates over 1 billion learners have been affected by school closures. And I think there's increasing fear that a lot of the girls who dropped out won't return to school, and that parents will increasingly look at the opportunity for economic security and social respectability, which we recently heard of, is going to be the sort of the pathway that girls go down rather than continuing their education. So I think whilst there has been increasing investment in more distant learning model, we're seeing globally an increasing divide between those who are better off and those who are worse off, and the digital divide being faced by girls is particularly sort of significant. So we're really keen, and a lot of our members are looking at sort of these sort of alternative education approaches, which Noreen touched on, which might be resorting to some more sort of traditional means, whether it's radio or TV, as opposed to some of the online platforms, which are not as accessible for girls. So there's going to be a big need for sort of catch-up courses and sort of accelerator programs for getting girls back into school. And I think really advocating to the education ministries to ensure that there are sort of community level campaigns so that parents continue to invest in girls' education. Otherwise, some of the advances we've seen in countries like India may well be reversed. Also very alarming, we're hearing a lot about increased cases of gender-based violence, increased early pregnancies, and the inability to get access to sexual and reproductive health services. So a lot of our members are looking at using online channels to sort of increase awareness of the risk of gender-based violence, but also to develop new referral pathways to ensure that girls have the information they need and know where they can sort of report sort of sexual violence and abuse. But there is a real challenge in terms of things like access to contraception, to safe abortion, and there is the fear amongst our members of increased rates of early pregnancy. So that in itself would be a potential sort of increased driver of child marriage. And I think also, you know, we've talked a lot so far about sort of social norms, but what we sense is that the whole sort of economic sort of meltdown of economies is going to really accelerate the incidence of child marriage, and that we're hearing, you know, that particularly in countries like India, where the sort of and other parts of South Asia, where sort of daily wage workers have lost the income overnight, migrant work has been particularly badly affected. These sort of more vulnerable populations and their families are really bearing the brunt of the lockdown. So a real concern amongst our members, many of whom are involved in providing essential food, water, hygiene products to these households. But really, even with this sort of community level response, it's not going to be enough without large scale government social protection systems and things like universal healthcare as part of a social protection system. So I think one of the things that we would like to see is sort of how can some of these sort of economic support mechanisms become more gender sensitive. For example, looking at how cash transfers could be accompanied with messaging about the importance of investing in girls' education. So I think that the scale of the economic response is the one of the key drivers, and need to find sort of measures to tackle this, particularly at scale. So if there's time in the questions, there are other areas as well we can touch on, but I'll leave it there for now because I know there are other questions to get through.
Thanks so much, Rachel, and thanks for highlighting some of the immediate impacts that we are seeing of COVID-19 on child marriage. And I think the point that you've highlighted about the economic drivers becoming so powerful, I think is also very much borne out by some recent research we've done together with UNICEF on child marriage in humanitarian settings, which basically shows that the deep drivers don't change. The social norms, the economic drivers, the sense of insecurity, the need to control adolescent sexuality, those things don't change, but their salience, their importance, and their impact does change in emergencies. Yep. And I think that's what we're seeing with the COVID-19 crisis. Mary, I'd like to come back to you to talk a little bit more about these intersections between marriage, work, and education. How can we ensure that opportunities and alternatives are available for women and girls beyond getting married or in addition to getting married? And how do you see the current COVID-19 crisis impacting on compulsory marriage and opportunities outside marriage for work and education?
Well, Ingrid, that's a lot of questions, and speaking, I can't help but try to answer these questions in the current moment, and that makes my answers extremely uncertain. I would echo a lot of what Rachel just said. The Asian Development Bank has predicted a 30% reduction in our economy. I think we're second only to Sri Lanka, and that's because Sri Lanka is so overwhelmingly dependent on tourism. We are seeing a situation where graduates, people with a BA or a BSc degree, are looking for daily wage work. We are seeing a situation where teachers in private schools are selling foodstuffs, on little carts on the roadside. So this is an unprecedented situation for us, and I wouldn't want to come out with a pat answer under these conditions. It does seem to mean then that the compulsory nature of marriage, if anything, will get tighter. And in fact, we were talking about the fact, in my own work, what was worrisome was that prior to COVID, we had an economic slowdown. We had greater declines in employment opportunities. In other words, a lessening of other alternatives to economic independence and autonomy, making, in fact, marriage even more compulsory than ever before. So can you imagine then the exponential ways in which that is going to get reinforced now? The interesting thing, though, is that we are getting, and that to me is a minor source of hope, is that there are very mixed, I think because of the extremely vibrant nature of civil society in our contexts and the active nature, we are getting, of course, these are anecdotal. We have no trends to report, but at the anecdotal level, we get reports of, for instance, yes, spurts in child marriages. But we hear, even here, the story is of, say, a 17-year-old girl in Murshidabad district of West Bengal who walks 11 kilometers to the local block development office to announce that her now impoverished family wants to marry her off, but that she doesn't want to get married. Now, what do we call this? This is incredible, actually, to think of someone actually engaging with the system to this extent. Others have actually said that as a byproduct, if you like, of the increased activity of local health workers, we have ASHA and other kinds of local health workers in our rural areas who are now, of course, overburdened with tasks of trying to spread awareness regarding COVID and safe practices regarding health and distancing and all of that. And this is from Shanta Sinha, a very well-known activist and person in South India, in Telangana and Andhra, who said that under these conditions, she felt actually a little more reassured that it would be much tougher under increased surveillance. It would be much tougher for families to try and engage in an underage marriage because there would be much more checking and much less movement. We talk about less mobility, but less mobility also means less chances for carrying out these kinds of, figuring out, a good match and doing all those things which require some level of public action. And that she felt that there would be less of that happening at this point. And even more interesting and to my mind, uplifting, and I think we heard about Rajasthan and young girls collectives. These have been in the past engaged with schooling, football clubs, and all kinds of very innovative ways of building confidence amongst young people. And they've also turned into quote unquote COVID warriors. So they're the ones who are going around in their villages because they have been to school and because they're better off in terms of being able to communicate. They're the ones who are going around and telling their elders and others what to do, what not to do, why you should not step out, why you should wear a mask, or whatever, and in my view, those would be figures who would then maybe not so easily be the people you'd want to marry off very quickly if you can actually see role models of this sort. What worries me the most is the fact, and this was, I think you mentioned this yourself, in India and I think in most parts of the world, schools are closed. This means that everybody is at home. Schools, colleges, everything is shut now. Children are at home. We are trying to figure out online this, that, and the other. And we are extremely worried about what that's going to imply because that's inevitably only going to increase the huge inequalities. Imagine, everybody trying to do online learning through their, phone, through the TV set, when you don't even have regular electricity in these regions, or, internet connections, forget internet connections. What will happen under these conditions? This has, I think, been pointed out by many of you. This is extremely worrisome, and this is going to call for great innovation in terms of then asking ourselves, not simply, and I would not want to narrow it down to child marriage. I would say, what do we do to make education still a possibility? What do we do to help parents think in terms of employability for themselves, let alone what they might do to their daughters? We need a holistic approach within which then, yes, the worry about increasing rates of child marriage can find a place rather than simply think, how do we prevent this girl from being married off? We will need to look at all of this together to make that a reality. Thanks, Ingrid.
Thanks, Mary, and thanks for highlighting both some positive examples of change that is happening on the ground and the way that people are responding. And also some of the concerns. And I think the point about education is very well taken. And it really is a reality across much of the region that women and girls do not have access to phones and computers and the internet and are not going to be able to continue learning or accessing online information and support for that matter, and are therefore at risk of being left further and further behind. So I want to come back to you now, Noreen, before we open up to the floor for some questions. And I just want to ask you if you'd like to share with us, what motivates your own work on child marriage, and based on your experience, what works and what do we need to do to end it?
Thank you, Ingrid. So my motivation goes a long way back to gender equality and especially to child marriage. And also professionally, I've been working on it for many, many years. My personal motivation, I have been a victim of child marriage at the age of 13. I was married off to a man who was 25 years older than me. And I come from a very, very conservative Pushtun family. My forefathers were from Kabul. So honor and, is very, very important. So because of the pressure from the elders, my father had died at a very young age. I was just given away. I was married. The contract was signed. But because my mother and my older brother initially had to, agree with the pressure from the jirga, from the elders. Couldn't do anything. One thing they managed to negotiate with the elders, jirga, was that because I was so young, maybe the consummation of the marriage or the going away of the bride should be delayed till I at least complete my 10th grade. And so when they took that stand, I was able to continue school, and I was able to delay that, we call it ruksati, giving away of the daughter finally. That was delayed for almost 5 years. And what happened in this time was that I had a lot of support from my brother, from a man in the family who stood up to everything against the jirga. So that was critical. And it also gave me time where I learned to raise my voice, where I learned to say my consent matters. So when my mother asked me, do you really want to? Do you agree? I said no. So, and then it took me, because in the certificate that I had signed, because I had no clue that what the nikah nama or the certificate looks like, then they normally put no to the right of the bride to get divorced according to Sharia. I had no clue, and they just put no. It took me 9 years to get divorced because nobody would support. And again, the only people who supported me in my family in Pakistan were my male cousins who were lawyers and my male family members. So for me, what is really important is to work with men, leaders, community leaders, religious leaders as allies. And what really again also matters is by the time, like in 5 years, my mother could show to the family, okay, so now she's got a bachelor's degree. Now she is capable of getting a job. So, like she's economically, she's going to bring in money. And I see that here in the remote areas of Bangladesh, where out of thousands, one girl has become a nurse or a teacher, and she's able to delay her marriage. I've just witnessed these things. And I think that's so education, but not just education, employability after that, you being able to earn and support the family and to show that, this can lead to the stability of the family was extremely, extremely important. So for me, as I said before, it is extremely important to keep working on practice beliefs people have. I agree with Mary, for especially from the society I come from, community I come from, marriage, the institution of marriage is sacred. Everybody has to get married, but we can influence through our work on when it should happen. Slowly, I mean, that could be the first step. So fine, it's given and it's sacred. Everybody should get married. Maybe the first step is to convince them when it should happen. So I think that's very important. If for me it had happened, 5 years or 6 years down the road, maybe I would have had a voice. Maybe I could say, no, wait a minute, I don't agree. I could have told my immediate family, but I wasn't able to say because I was a kid. And, in those days, kids were really kids. I mean, we had no clue. Things have changed a lot now. So, so I think those are the things that the voice and the consent and being able to have the courage to say no, and empowerment of the family itself, and bringing the fathers and brothers into this dialogue. Discussion is very important. I now sit in my family in Canada and Pakistan, and I open discussion when somebody is getting married. I open up discussions on, we know how much hak meher, bride price, the boy will pay. So the parents are negotiating, and I sit there again as now an older woman, and I say, okay, so can we also check if the girl and the boy know what is in the contract? And they get very angry. They think that I'm some Western, somebody who's against the religion. So they get annoyed. But you have to. So I think these are the reactions, and these are things we need to change. I mean, we have a right. The girl and the boy have a right. So we have a lot of things, laws and policies, but people need to know, and we need to change the mindset for people to believe in what is written, the age of marriage, and what's written in the contract of marriage, and all of that. I'll stop here. It makes me very emotional. Thank you.
Thank you, Noreen, and thank you so much for sharing that story with us. It's a very personal story, but it actually also illustrates many of the themes we've been discussing today around the agency, but also the systemic nature of marriage and the fact that it's not only the girl who may come under pressure, but the family as a whole, and that it's not a marriage between individuals. It's very often a marriage that happens between families and in the context of a community and a society. So it's not just about individual agency and choice. So with that, Roy, I'd like to open up maybe for a round of questions, and maybe if you could just read a couple of questions that have come in on the Facebook Live and the YouTube Live channels that we're getting from the floor, and then I will ask our panelists if they would like to respond to one or any of those. So over to you, Roy, for some questions.
Sure. I think we have time for a couple of questions. There is one from Scarlett Hawkins. She asks, what lessons can we learn from the early stages of the discussions in countries like Bangladesh and Nepal, where initial advocacy was taking place to convince stakeholders of the harms of early and forced marriage? How can these lessons learned be further adapted for other contexts where the understanding of these issues is, as of now, much lower?
And could you maybe read one or two more, Roy, and then I think we'll take a round from the panel and come back.
Sure. There is a question from Jamil Ahmed Chowdhury, who says that the role of faith groups is very critical in any child marriage legislation because the politicians are very worried and very concerned about faith groups and faith leaders, and they bow down in front of them in many contexts. So how can we work better with faith groups? What has worked so far?
Okay, thank you so much, Roy. And I think I also noticed in the group as well a question about the urban-rural divide and urban and rural differences, which we've also touched on in the discussion a bit already. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open to our panelists, and please just take any of those questions. But if you could comment in your response on what we are learning, how we engage the religious leaders and other authorities for change, and Noreen already touched on this in her response, and what are some of the persistent and significant divides that we see, like the urban-rural divide, that perpetuate the practice of child marriage. So don't feel that you have to respond to all of these, just pick one or two in your answer. And Rachel, I'm going to start with you.
Thank you. And I have the advantage of being able to pick the question I'd like to answer, which is I think the role of faith groups. And I think it's a really critical issue. And we did some work last year with the University of Stellenbosch looking at working with faith leaders, and that was looking at across different sort of religions, whether it's Christianity, Hinduism, looking at Islam. And I think one of the things that was very apparent is the importance of doing some sort of political economy analysis or understanding the power mapping, because it's not always straightforward. And in some cases, you may not want to work with faith leaders if they're significant blockers, and there may actually be a backlash. And so what we were looking at is what are the different forms of resistance and different forms of support, but really the importance of particularly community-based organisations understanding what are the sort of how the different religious hierarchies can actually challenge or perpetuate child marriage in different contexts. And our sense is that really doing that important contextual analysis is incredibly important. And, I worked on a program in northern Nigeria in quite a sort of conservative part of Kano, where religious leaders were incredibly supportive in tackling gender inequality and were taking to through the mosques and through the airwaves, talking about the importance of gender equality. But other contexts, particularly in some more sort of conservative political contexts where there is a unholy nexus of religion and politics that can perpetuate. So I think we need to, as sort of gender activists, get quite savvy on the sort of political economy aspect about where and when not to engage. But I'd be happy to share that resource after if anybody's interested.
Thanks so much, Rachel. And thanks for highlighting the need to be political in our understanding and our analysis and our approach, and not just see these as, social and economic issues only. Noreen, I'm going to come back to you, and please, you might want to take any of those, but maybe you could focus a bit also on lessons learned.
Yeah, so I think here in Bangladesh, under the joint program that we have with UNFPA, we work quite a lot with religious leaders. We work with the department or something of religion here, and we work at the district level with the mullahs, with the people in the mosques. I think one of the lessons and the challenge we face, and I saw exactly the same in North Nigeria. I also worked in the northern part of Nigeria on the same issue. So while these people that we are trying to convince and trying to give them messaging that they can disseminate through the mosques, the Friday prayers, the khutbah, one question that you always see on their faces, even if they don't ask, and some of the bold ones in North Nigeria asked me that. So, we are giving these khutbahs and we tell them this is not good and but what is this? What is the solution? So if they don't marry their daughters early, what do they do with them? So what can the government, what can the system do to enable them to continue school or empower the parents or give parents social protection, social safety nets to keep paying for their education? If you don't give us this, all the work, I really believe, and this is not just based on my work in Bangladesh, also from North Nigeria, Pakistan, is that, we need to be able to give solutions. We especially in terms of, when we are talking, we are handling such a sensitive area. We need to be able to give solutions. We cannot, so it has to be, we have to address different drivers. That's why the multi-sectoral approach is so important. Another lesson I think that we are trying to now address here is, and I also experienced that in Pakistan, is that to speak to faith-based groups, religious groups, you need to engage progressive people like myself. I'm a Muslim, but you need to really engage authorities in religions which can speak to, for example, the importance of child marriage in Sharia. If I'm to speak, so I think that part that needs to happen, because you cannot speak to these people who will just take any surah or any verse from the Quran and tell you this is what the Quran says, and then you sit there and you have no idea what to say. UNICEF in 2000. When I joined in 2001 or 2002, had come out with a manual on child rights in Islam. And the first thing that the manual said was the first verse that came down from wherever was Iqra, which means education, learn. So, the emphasis there, because the manual focused a lot on learning, education as a tool for empowerment for children. And that's what it started with. So I think those are very, very important things. But also, I think we have been addressing a lot, religious leaders or the mullahs from the mosque. But I think we have to look at how we embed these messaging in the madrasas. in South Asia, there are tons of madrasas, especially in the remote areas where the prevalence is high. So we need to look at the madrasas. We need to look at the little Islamic study subject that people study in schools. I studied that. We call it Dinyat. So I think we need to use those platforms also for this kind of messaging, which is where the premise is faith, is religion. And I'm only speaking to Islam because I know that more. So I'll just stop there.
Thank you so much, Noreen. And I can see that we're getting additional questions, but I think we are running out of time. So I'm just going to come to Mary for a response to any of those questions. And for everyone online, who's sent additional questions, we'll see if we can respond to those after the session. Over to you, Mary.
Yeah, just to add to the discussion, I don't work with faith-based groups. I'm a researcher, but I just wanted to say that we have to be very cautious here. There's plenty of room for, I would even call it, misinformation. There's a tendency to think that when we say faith-based, we are most concerned about Islam. I want to say that the data does not support this, whether in India or in Africa. In fact, in India, the largest percentages, there's 1% more of underage marriages happening in the Hindu community compared to the Muslim community. It is in countries like the USA where you have, I would say, the most virulent form of faith-based, that is to say, evangelical Christianity in southern states of the USA, such that they refuse to have any minimum age at marriage in several states of the USA. I don't know if you know this, but several states of the USA, as of today, do not even have a minimum age on their statute books, because they go to the Bible and they say in the Bible there is no such thing, and we therefore do not believe in such a thing. There's a movement in the USA of against these issues, and they're having quite a battle over it. So I think we need to be very, very cautious as to what possible stereotypes might creep in, what assumptions might creep into our thinking. In India, we have higher ages of marriage amongst all religious groups. It is true that Sikhs and Christians are somewhat less in practicing early ages at marriage, but Sikhs, on the other hand, are the biggest practitioners of gender-biased sex selection. So, where are we on that one? I am myself, I think it's the political economy, it's the educational aspects that are much, much greater. And I do believe that mullahs and pandits and others are playing a role with the most impoverished sections of their respective populations. The better off Muslims, the better off whoever are in a position to decide otherwise and follow other kinds of dictates. So I think that's where we need to play a role. We need to be very careful about whether we are reinforcing a problem rather than actually improving one.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you for reminding us that this is an issue that cuts across countries, it cuts across religions, it cuts across regions, and is not only something that happens in South Asia or in Africa or in the Middle East, it happens in so-called West as well. And I think that was a very good example that you shared. So I think with that, I know that we're running close to time, Roy. So what I'd like to do is just to come back to Bangladesh for a last moment, and we want to show a short TVC from the global program from UNICEF and UNFPA in Bangladesh before we close our session. And before we do that, I just want to give a really huge thanks to all of our panelists for a very wide-ranging discussion where we've talked about the causes and the drivers, the consequences of child marriage, the impact of COVID, and what needs to be done to change this harmful practice. So back to you, Roy.
Thank you. And may I ask our IT colleagues to play the video?
নানু বাড়ি যাইতে হইব চল
ছুটি হয় নাই তো
কিছু হইব না বাড়ি যাইতে হইব
আমি আরেকটু ব্যাটিং করি
পরে করিস
বাড়িতে কি হইছে আব্বা কও না
তোরে দেখতে আইতাছে
কেন
তোর বিয়া ঠিক করছি
আমি যামু না।
এমন করিস না মা।
আমি বিয়া বমু না, আমি পড়মু।
আচ্ছা পড়িস নে, এখন চল।
ওর তো এখনো 18ই হয়নি মোকলেস মিয়া।
হয় নাই হইব।
কবে হইব চাচা?
বাল্য বিয়ে দায়ভার আমাদের সবার, তাই বাল্য বিয়ে দেখলেই প্রতিবাদ করুন, রুখে দাঁড়ান, খবর দিন স্থানীয় প্রশাসনকে, কল করুন 109 নম্বরে। বাল্য বিয়ে রুখতে হলে আওয়াজ তুলো তালে তালে।
Thank you so much for that video. And before we close the session, I would like to turn to Bjorn once again for any final thoughts or your sentiments on what you've heard so far this afternoon here. Bjorn.
Thank you so much, Roy. First of all, Noreen, I really would like to thank you for sharing your story. It gives us a whole new perspective, if you like, and better, deeper understanding when somebody comes out and speak, and it makes it even more important for us at UNFPA and with partners such as UNICEF and others to really work to make sure that we receive zero harmful practices. And in the case of UNFPA, that is our goal for 2030. So thank you, Noreen, so much for that. Listening to also Mary and to Rachel and Ingrid, I am even more convinced that, if we are really going to move things forward in Asia and the Pacific, and if we are going to make this long-lasting transformative changes, it is gender equality and human rights that we need to focus on. And having said that, of course, we need to be able to, like you are saying, Mary, things are different in different parts of the world, and we need to find good strategies. And I think, Rachel, you really highlighted that, how you can work in different contexts as well. Because, there are situations that we need to understand, and to be able to make these fundamental changes in societies, you really need to start from a bottom-up approach and work with people and to make sure that, everyone understands how things could be done differently. And also and in that way, really make sure that the value of women and girls is equal men and boys. It's absolutely necessary in this. So thank you, all three of you, for taking your time, and especially Noreen. Also, I know that you are participating from Canada, so it must be middle in the night for you. But very much thank you, and back to you, Roy.
Thank you so much, Bjorn, and thank you all to our panelists. Thanks to Ingrid, and thanks to all of you in the audience for having joined us in this day and age of Zoom webinars and Facebook Live events. We hope that this has been truly compelling and truly informative for the audience. And as we said at the start of this session, we've got two more special events linked to the State of World Population. And so next Tuesday, which is the 7th of July at 10 a.m. Bangkok time, we will focus on gender-biased sex selection, and the panel is called No More Missing Girls. We will have three world-famous advocates and specialists speaking about that. And then on the 14th, which is 2 weeks from now, at 3 p.m. Bangkok time, we will be joined by three amazing young people who have been tackling harmful practices, each in their own way in their own countries. So please join us for that. Spread the word, share your comments, follow us on social platforms, and thank you all very much once again. Take care, stay safe. Goodbye for now.